Anybody?
Object-oriented programming kind of keeps everything more segregated from each other. Like everything's an object and functions are kept within objects so that things don't mess up other sections of code.
Okay.
That could.
Yeah, that's one way to, yeah. Anybody else? So I like to think like function, like the difference between functional programming and object-oriented programming is that function, what we've been doing up until yesterday, we've been doing functional programming. Functions generally don't know anything. Functions are literally just a set of instructions where objects or classes, they know something about themselves. That's why we call instances. So think of like a function to open, like to open something. If I were to write just like a basic function to open, it would need to know what I'm opening. So for example, opening a laptop, opening a car door, opening a package, shipment package, opening a front door to a house. The way you open all those items, whether it's a laptop, a book, a package, the operations to open up open up those things are all different. We can't just say to write a function to open and it will automatically know how to open every single type of like thing we're trying to open. The function would have to have data passed into it as a parameter or as an argument to tell it how to open each specific object. So a function essentially is kind of dumb. It doesn't know anything unless you pass in data into it. Where objects and object-oriented programming, they already inherently know things about itself. They have attributes, they have specific instructions or methods on how to do specific operations. So if I were to write a method like to open just as a function, I would need to pass in like what am I actually opening in order for the function to know what steps to take to open that specific item. So whether it's a front door, a package, or a book. Whereas objects, I can create an object called a laptop or an object or called book or an object called house. And within those objects, I can have a instance method called to open. And each instance method to open can operate very specific to that specific object, like a house, car, book, or laptop. And that to open within that specific class would have specific instructions on how to open only that specific object. So objects and object-oriented programming, they inherently they already know data about themselves. They are inherently, they essentially have data stored about themselves so they can access later and know how to perform specific operations in a specific way to that specific object, whether it's a laptop, a car, a house, whatever. So that's kind of how I think of object-oriented programming versus functional programming. Functions are kind of dumb. They really just have a set of instructions and they don't know how to do anything outside of that unless you pass in data directly into the function, which then you'd have to, manipulate that data and what operations to perform based off of that function's inputs. So let's create a class called student, because a student is a person, place, or thing kind of. So class student. And what are some attributes about the student that we might need to know?
GPA.
GPA. So generally a student, we can do def, init, dot self. Obviously, you need a first name, We can do last name. We can do GPA. We can do whether a student is enrolled or not. Do an ID. That's good enough for now. We can do self. So we want to access a student's first name throughout the object. So self.last name. Last name. GPA, self.GPA. You can say GPA. What I know, Danny, you're saying like having default answers or default inputs. So GPA, when a student is first created, they're gonna have a GPA of 0. So that's how we can do default answers or default attributes. And I'm gonna actually move this ID over here. ID enrolled. I'm going to set that attribute to false. So when a student is created, they're not initially enrolled in anything. Self.enrolled. Enrolled. So if I only pass in first name, last name, and ID and don't pass in GPA or enrolled, these values are initially the default will be 0 and false. So let's create a student called Tom. Student, Tom, create ID 123. And what if I didn't put a GPA or enrolled status or put in a GPA argument or enrolled value? Let's see what happens if I print Tom. Should
you don't have any repr or string, way to print that object or sorry, that class.
Right. Python OOP. So what's going to look like? It's just going to look like a student object. But what if I got rid of these default values? What's it going to print?
You'll have an error. I can't remember which type error. There we go.
Yep. So we're missing 2 arguments. So that's one way we can have default values. All right. So let's create another student called Ruthie. Student. Ruthie. Cohen. ID is, 456. We can have a GPA of 0 and enrolled false. We could also input these. Ruthie. Clear. So now we have 2 student objects created. One is called Tom, one is called Ruthie. Let's see. What do I want to do with Ruthie? I want to see if they're enrolled. So I want to see if Tom is enrolled and Ruthie is enrolled. What should this equal? False, false?
False.
False, false. Great. So I want to write a method called def enroll student that doesn't take in any arguments other than self, because we always need the self. And self dot enrolled equals true. And we can just do return self dot enrolled. What kind of variable is self dot enrolled?
Boolean? Wait, no, not type of.
What kind of variable in relation to the class?
It's in relation to the class, it's just an instance variable. So each person or each version of that particular class won't be able to know what the other one's is without interacting with it in a different way.
Correct.
So if you change it in one, it doesn't change it in all.
All right. Exactly. It's an instance variable. And what kind of method is this enroll student called? It's just called an instance method. So I checked print Tom enrolled is false. Print Ruthie enrolled is false. But in between here, I want to tom.enroll student and invoke it. And then I also want to print whether whether Tom's enrolled after it as well. So what should we expect to see printed out down here? Tom is enrolled initially is false. We print Tom enrolled, or we invoke enroll student method, which should change the instance variable enrolled to true. We print the instance variable enrolled, so this should be true. And we also test whether or not Ruthie is enrolled. So we should expect false, true, false. False, true, false. So instance variables are unique to each instance. So they're totally separate. So this self-enrolled for Tom is different than the self-enrolled for Ruthie. What, say I want to declare a class variable called total enrolled students. What is, I just kind of said what it is. What is this? It's outside of the init. It doesn't have a self to it. It's on the same indentation line as all the methods, the instance methods. What is this called?
It's class variable.
It's a class variable. And how is a class variable different than an instance variable?
It's shared among all of the instances, and you don't use self with it. So it'd be good for like counting how many instances of that class you have.
Yep, correct. So you have access this total enrolled students class variable through all the instances. So if I enroll a student, now how do I access this total enrolled? So I'm just going to do like total enrolled students plus equals 1. Does that work? Let's see if that works. So if I enroll a student, this is total enrolled students. I just want to print this. Oh no, local variable total enrolled students reference before assignment.
You have to put the class name before it, like you do with self for instance variables.
So in order for me to access this total, correct. In order for me to access this total enrolled students variable, I need to put student dot to reference the class. So before the self references the instance, we have to put the student, which is the name of the class, to reference the class variable.
You can use self too.
I can use self. Well, but doesn't that change it to an instance variable or no?
I'm not sure on that. I don't think so.
Yeah, it would definitely make it an instance variable. I think you would shadow the class variable.
Because the memory address for the class variable isn't going to change. So if you change that variable, it's going to change the change it. It should remain a class variable.
Right, because I think you're going to have two. You're going to have an instance variable of that same identifier and a class variable of that same identifier, and that's going to create problems.
So 1 students. So if I do Tom, Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. All right. So we have the student dot total enrolled students to reference the class variable. So I think someone said put a self and then, yeah, I'm not going to go down that route just for time's sake. So if I do total enrolled students for Tom and total enrolled students for Ruthie, what do you think is going to show up? What should be these two values? So the Tom dot total enrolled students and Ruthie total enrolled students. What should be this value after I already enroll Tom?
They should both be 1.
Let's check it out. 1, 1. Yep. Cool. Does anybody have any questions about class variables? And let's just test to see if Ruthie is enrolled. So it would be false, false. We'll move that down here. So Tom is enrolled. The total enrolled students is now 1. The total enrolled students class for Ruthie is also 1, even though Ruthie is not enrolled. Enroll student.
Why would that be? Why would, if Ruthie hasn't been enrolled, why would her total enrolled be 1?
Because this total enrolled students represents the entire class. So it goes across this variable. It's a class instance. So every single instance has access to this variable.
And they share the same value of that variable.
Correct. Yep.
So as long, okay. So if you enrolled Tom again, then Ruthie would go to 2, just like Tom does.
Yep, and we can do that. Well, yeah, we can, but
Yeah.
Let's see. True. Well, I guess it didn't go. Why didn't it do it? Oh, enroll student. So if I enrolled Tom for twice for some reason, it'd be 2. But in here, if we wanted to enroll Ruthie and see Tom's total enrolled students at the very end. True, it's initially 1, then Ruthie enrolls, and now the total enrolled students is 2. Now, ideally, so like total enrolled students wouldn't be necessarily associated with a student. Like a student wouldn't want to know how many students are enrolled. That would probably be in another class called like school. And now that might have a variable that has a count of how many students are enrolled in it. But we'll get to that later this week and next week.
As an example where you actually could use the total enrolled students would be if you want to have each student have their class rank, or what percentile they are in the class, as a comparison. So they could use that number of other students as a dividend, the bottom number, the denominator, in a division. So like, class rank would be a certain thing. And if you want to find out what percentile they are in the class, you just do the math with that.
Yep. So class variables are variables that you'd want to use across every single instance.
Tom?
Yep.
I know you don't want to get too far into this, but I'll address what they were saying about the self thing.
Yep.
Line 14. When it's integers, when it's like immutable types, I believe, if you said self dot total enrolled students and then you set it equal to a new type like that, that's like an immutable type, it'll set it on the instance and it will leave the class attribute alone. It will leave it as its original memory address, so it won't change it. But if you set it to a list and like you appended, if you did self dot total enrolled students dot append and you were appending to a list, it doesn't modify or it doesn't recreate at a new address. It just reuses that memory address. So then you would alter the class attribute if you guys can follow that. I can put some code together just to demonstrate it if you guys want to actually see what happens when you start messing with that stuff.
Yeah, if you guys want to do like a breakout session, you guys can do that. Definitely.
It's definitely good to know how that works when you start getting really into it.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's like pass by reference versus pass by. I think that's specifically.
That's what I was thinking. I'd have to see the code to see, but I put a code snippet in Slack and tested it. Yeah, your self variable name and your class same variable name. They're two totally different variables.
Okay. Cool. All right. With that, I'm going to